Hello and welcome to the 12th video that I'll be posting in my Unity platformer series. And in today's video, we will be discussing about player's animation. So what we're going to do directly is open our scripts folder and open our player controller script. Okay, and once we've done this, we're going to go directly to the top and we're going to create a new inspector variable. And as you guessed from the previous video, I did mention about Animator being able to control our animations. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna make an inspector variable for our player's animator. So to do this, like before, we're gonna make a private, and it's gonna be an animator. So animator, and the name of the animator will be player anim, and then as always, end with a semicolon, and then we are going, as usual, going to go to the void start and type in our get component. So player anim equals to get component, and then animator brackets and end with a semicolon. Okay, so now what we did was make sure that the system knows or identify whether or not or which component we are talking about, and that component in this case is animator. Okay, and now once we're done with that, we can actually create a new variable, not an inspector variable but a normal variable, and it's gonna be a private enum. Okay, so this is a new term for all of you, and enum here is basically like a list. Okay, it's basically a form of list, and I'm going to create an enum called state, which will contain all of our actions for our player. So idle, running, jumping. Okay, so let me explain to you what is this enum here. So as you know, private is always found in a variable, and in Unity, private means that it will never be identified in our player controller script, where we can choose which inspector or variable we want to use, and I use private, so that means it's going to be private. And enum here is actually going to be a keyword used to make a variable somewhat like a list. Okay, and the name of the list will be state, and then inside of the state there will be items that you choose or objects, and I chose idle, running, and jumping. Okay, and the way enum works is by making sure that idle here is actually going to identify the number. So states.idle is 0, states.running is 1, and states.jumping is 2. As you can see, these are actually objects that I've chosen in order to show numbers. And out of all my Unity programming experience, I have chosen enum as my main component for my animation, as it's really simple to actually change or state which animation that I want to use when this specific variable or condition happens. And I'll show you why, because as soon as I start coding in all the conditions, you'll see why enum is really needed. Now, below it, I'm going to make a variable for the enum. And like I said before, enum is basically just a list. And if you don't have a variable for the list, then the information is just basically a list that nobody will use. And the way we can use or create a variable is we make a private or public, it's up to you. And then I'm gonna name this player state. There you go. So the way this works is by, since state is the name of the list, so when we want to refer to that list, we just type in the name of the list, and that's state. Okay, so basically the name of the list becomes the type, like where where this private is a private, as you know, variables are private public, and then the type is rigid body 2D, right? Well, this also applies for private enum, so the name becomes the name of the list, or enum becomes the type. So type in the name of the enum and that state, and then we're gonna type in the name of the variable, and that's gonna be player state. And then I'm going to equals this to state dot idle, so that when the game initializes, it knows that it's gonna be state dot idle. As you know, always end with a semicolon. And that's it. Now we're gonna directly go to the Unity and go to our animator screen. And in here, like I said before, we're gonna make parameters. And parameters are basically those variables that help us allow to change from one animation to another. So to create a parameter, you click on the plus button here and click on the int, because we're using an enum, and int and enum works well with each other, and that's why I want to use int. So I click on int, and the name will be state. Okay, and state will be 0, and I'm going to create a link from player idle to player run. And the way we can do this is we go to player idle, then click on make transition. It's gonna give us an arrow here, and then we can connect it with our player run. And when you click on the arrow and go to our conditions here, and we can click on the plus. Basically, these conditions are, if this condition is fulfilled, then it goes to player run. So we go to our state. We can just say, we can leave this for now, and then in player run, and make another transition to player idle, so that when this condition is fulfilled, which I'm going to click add to show the condition, it's going to go back to player idle. Okay, and then now we go back to our program, and we're going to create a new method. And the method that I'm going to create will be called animation state. Okay, so pause the video right now, and I want you guys right now to create a method called animation state. Just put in the curly brackets, and that's it. Okay, so as you know, making a method in Unity is very simple. All you need to do is create a void, type in the word void, and the name of the method, which is animation state, right? And then click enter, shift curly brackets, and then enter, and we form the paragraph where all of our code will be executed. And I want my code to be if, let's just say, when our player is moving to the left or right, then it will run, and left or right, right? And then we want to this to activate run animation, right? So when our player is moving to the left or right, we want it to activate animation. And when we say move left and right, in terms of position, it's just changing X, right? So we can just type in here, if our player RB, because when I say force, we got to go back to rigid body, and then we just say velocity, and then since we want to say left or right, and it deals with X, we can go to dot X. So now it knows that player RB dot velocity dot X, and then what is our operators? I just say if it's bigger than 1, for example, that means it's moving, right? Then we want it to activate the run animation. And to do that, we can go back to our variable that we've created before, called, where's the variable? Here you go, this variable right here, player state right here. So we can just say, we can type in player state equals to state dot running, and end with a semicolon. So the way this works is by going to our player state variable, and this variable is a private form of state. That means this variable can only have these three types of value: state.idle, state.running, and state.jumping. And the way this works for line 15 is that this variable will be initialized with state idle, and then if player rb.velocity.x is bigger than 1, then it will go to state.running. And I'll make the connection with our animator in a sec. And then we're going to create another statement, and that's going to be an else statement, because if this condition happens, it's going to go to state running. But there's nothing that will return that state to idle again. So we're going to make an else statement, else, then it's going to go back to player state equals to state dot idle. So this means that if this condition, which is essentially moving left or right, because it's changed in x, it's bigger than 1. I mean, it's directly changing moving left or moving right now. It's gonna go to running. And if it doesn't change in x, then essentially it's not moving. Right? It's not moving. So now it's basically going to idle. So that is the logic behind these if and else statement right now. And then, as you can see, the text here isn't as bold as this one, as you can see in color. This is much darker and this is much more lighter. And the reason why this is showing is because, like before, I think in my previous video, I did mention that if we do not call the function, then the code inside of it won't be executed. And this is how Visual Studio shows it to me. And the way we can do this or call this function is either putting it inside a variable or method that is in void update, or you can directly type in it in the void update. So type in void update animation state. However, doing this isn't efficient as it's not clear, and the main reason why I don't want to do this is because it's just going to be unorganized. The code won't be unorganized. So the way I can organize the code is by making sure I'm putting down the method inside of player movement. I'm putting it in player movement. It's because void update already contains player movement. So this means that player movement is updated once per frame, and everything inside of it means that it's going to be updated once per frame. As you can see, jump method is also inside of player movement. And if I put animation state inside player movement, it's basically the same thing as saying that player movement, then inside of player movement there's animation state. However, it's still inside of void update, but just inside of player movement. And that's basically what I am doing when putting the animation state inside of player movement right here. So that is the reason why I'm putting it inside player movement, because it's going to be much more organized, and overall it's going to help make the reader or coder of the game or game developer more idea and how to organize the program and code. So I prefer to put inside player movement instead of void update, because animation, as you know, is part of the player movement. Okay, and I would like to also add another line of code, and that is player anim, which is our variable to tell the computer that we are talking about the animator right now. Player anim, and then we want to set integer. Set integer. The reason why we want to set the integer is because we've made a variable called state, and it's in the form of an integer. So player anim dot set integer, and then what we want is actually the name. Set integer, and then it says int id or string name. And as you know, the variable is called state, so we're gonna type in the string name, and string is any text with quotation marks. So string, and we're gonna go in state comma int value. And the int value right now is going to be our player state, because player state is gonna always change, right? And we can't say that we want to take this state here because this is a list, and the list will contain all the information, but this variable will get the list information. Okay, so we're gonna type in our player state, and then, as you know, always end with a semicolon. Now the main problem with this is that it says here that it's wrong. It cannot convert player's controller.state to int, right? And as a matter of fact, it actually can. You know why? Well, the reason why is because enum is essentially holding out a number. As you can see, if I go to idle here and then drag my cursor on top of it, it says state.idle equals 0. Then state.running equals 1. State.jumping equals to 2. And state.idle here, when we type state.idle, what the developer sees is state.idle, of course. And the computer also sees it as state.idle. However, if we type in here the value int here, int like this, then what the computer sees before the int here, so let's just say I delete int right here. So what the computer sees when we say player state equals state.running is that player state equals to states.running. Okay? And if we put the int here, it refers to states.running as a number. States.running equals to 1. I hope that makes sense. And now, if we go back to our Unity program right now and edit our conditions here, if we want idle to go to run, that means our state must be running, and our state.running is equals to 1. So when state equals to 1, then it goes to running. Then if state equals to 0, then it goes to idle. Yeah. So now if we click play, we can see that it's idling, it's running, it's idling, it's running. You can see it is running. However, jumping is not a problem right now. Okay, as you can see, now the player is changing from idling to running at times. Now, I'm going to revise the code, and let's start revising everything. Okay. So if we get our program here, we can see that we've added 2 lines of code in our inspector variable, and that's private animator.playerAnim, and our initializing, which is playerAnim equals to get component animator. And that's pretty self-explanatory, as I've been explaining to you that we have to create a variable for the animator component, and then to initialize it, we use our variable name playerAnim, and then we get component so that the computer knows which component we are actually talking about. And in our normal variables, we've added 2 lines of code here, and these are really important because, as you know, programming in Unity, when it comes to animations, the most easiest way I've learned out of all my Unity experience is the enums. Enums are so helpful when it comes to programming animations, because we can just say, if, for example, this happens, then we just say player state.idle, or directly say, if this condition happens, like player is falling, then we just say player state equals to states.falling. So it's really simple to change from one animation to another by using enums. And then this value here is how we make a list, and private, as you know, is a private variable, as you know. Then enum here is the keyword used to make list. And the funny thing about this list is that it doesn't use brackets, but curly brackets. I want you guys to remember that it doesn't use brackets. And the name for the list becomes a type. Okay? So when we want to make a variable for the list, we have to type in the type of the variable, private or public, and then the type of the variable, which is state, and then the name, which is player state, and then we gotta initialize it to what state we want to talk about. And the awesome thing about this is actually player state can only take these answers here. So player state cannot take, let's say, player state cannot take like state dot, say, state dot flying, for example. It cannot, because as a matter of fact, our enum only has idle, running, and jumping. And player state can only contain equals to state.idle, state.running here, running, and jumping. And as you can see now, there's only 3 options. There can't be more than these 3 options. And if you want to add a new type of enum here, or add to the list, you can just type in type new, like that. And then if we go back to our states.idle here, and then we see that there is actually a new option, which is type new. So basically what I'm trying to say is that enum, a variable enum, can only contain all the information from the list. So basically, this is a variable that can use the information created by the list. And the list is this enum here, enum state. Okay? And we didn't change anything here. As you know, get component animator so that the computer knows which component we're talking about. Goes down here. And I'll discuss this later because this is the last part of the programming today. And animation state here. This is a void method. And as you know, this is a method. And if we don't call a method, no matter how many times you program it, if you don't call the method, then everything you put inside the method will be executed. And I'll discuss that later, why I put this in this again, in this method here. And inside of animation state, we've got this code right here. And this code essentially means that player rb.velocity.x, which means that when the rigid body of the player is actually moving in the x position and it's bigger than 1, then we can say that player state equals to states.running. Okay? And I want to edit this value, for example. As you can see, in the game just now, it has some delay. So let's just change it to 0.1 f. And the way I use f here, actually, is to identify that it's a float. Okay? So, if you remember from yesterday's video, I did mention about floats, right? Where is the float? Floats are basically digits or numbers or value of numbers that can be found in decimal places. And that is really helpful when it comes to player rb.velocity.x. And what I like to do when I calculate velocity, as you know, I'm going to use a mathf here, dot absolute number. And the reason why I like to use absolute number is because I do not want any miscalculations when it comes to calculating velocity. And using mathf.absolute just helps the number to be much more identifiable by the computer, and calculating it's much easier. So there will be less bugs and less errors when it comes to velocity counting. And then we have the else statement here, and the reason why I'm using an if and else statement is because if this condition isn't happening, then it's gonna directly go to the else statement. And the else statement that I create is that player state equals to state.idle, which means that if it's not moving, then what do we want? And we want it to be idle again. So we type in player state equals to state.idle. And I said before, enum variables are very awesome when it comes to making animations, because it's really easy to just change from one state to another state in an instant. And it's just really simple. And finally, we have this code here. And I placed it in player movement because I've decided that animation is part of the movement, right? And I want it to be much more organized, so I'm going to put it in player movement. And the reason why this still works is because player movement is inside of void update, which means that player movement is called once per frame, and which means that animation state is called once per frame because everything inside of player movement is called once per frame. And animation state contains this, so basically this is called once per frame. And yeah. And then this code right here is actually being able to connect our state variable here with our player state. So player anim, as you know, is our variable that we create in our program to identify our animator. Then we want to set integer, which is like edit the integer that we created for our variable and that state. And then it asks us for the name so we can know specific type of the variable. As a matter of fact, if you create a lot of ints like this, other int like this, other int, other int, other int, and if you don't specify the name, that means all of them will change, right? So that's why Unity have decided to create this string name so that we can know which variable or parameters that we want to edit. And then this value here, this is asking for the value that we can change for state. And since int player state, for this case, I just say state running here, is 1. That means it changes the state to 1. Okay? Now, if we click play right here, it's supposed to be much more responsive. So you can see only a slight nudge, you can move it right directly. Yeah. So in the next video, we will still be discussing about animations and specifically on jumping and falling animations, which are much more complex than this. And if you're still confused with this, not to worry, because I'll be discussing this more on the next video, and I will make a specific video for reviewing all the code we've done. So just try to find the logic behind the programming, and I hope you guys understand a lot more. And I know there's a lot to take in, so just try to review the code. And as you know, I'm going to try to put in more challenges for you to do, because you can understand far more if you start doing the programming itself and pause the video and do all the challenges. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I think that's it for me today. And I'll see you in the next video.